You can go.
Hello, we are Luis, Ricardo, Thais, and Julia, and we are going to be measuring well-being. First, we will have an introduction, then an interpretation of data, a scientific methodology, and a critical analysis, and after we will be having a conclusion. This report will have the goal of analyzing well-being indexes such as the GDP per capita and the Human Development Index in countries that are in different stages of development. From this analysis, we will be able to draw conclusions if these indicators are efficient when it comes to measuring well-being. Firstly, China and the United States will be compared, two of the main economic superpowers in the world. After, we'll be comparing developed, economic transition, and developing countries, and we will make observations regarding their GPDs and its composition. It is in the analysis of the indicators of health, education, and income where we can see that there are major differences between developed and developing countries. To continue with cross-sectional data, we will choose 3 countries for each of the 3 development stages. And finally, we will analyze the Human Development Index as a measure of well-being.
Regarding GDP and its components as a measure of material well-being, we can start by analyzing time series of data comparing US and China. After comparing the 2 countries chosen, we can see that in the case of China, the gross capital formation is bigger than in the US, and this can be explained because of the fact that economic growth in China has been higher than in the American country in the last years. Thus, people have invested more in the former mentioned. Secondly, both countries have a similar value regarding government spending. Nonetheless, the one from the US has been more stable throughout time, whilst China's has been continuously increasing in the last years. Thirdly, we need to highlight the significant difference between their household consumption expenditure, being the one from the US more than double than the one from China. And we also need to take into consideration that due to the extensive population of China, which is more than 4 times bigger than the US, the difference between these two in terms of per capita income is very high. Last but not least, we need to analyze the importance of net exports in both countries, being completely different from each other within the 2 nations. Since the US imports more than it exports, it has a trade deficit, and on the contrary, China has a lot more exports than imports, having a trade surplus. Regarding cross-sectional data, we chose 3 developed, economic transition, and developing countries. When comparing the countries within the 3 categories and taking into consideration the GDP's components, we can state that there are many differences among them. To begin with, developing countries tend to have the lowest GDP among all nations that are being compared. Nonetheless, we can see that countries in economic transition do not have a very large GDP in comparison with developed countries who have the highest composition. We can see that in developed countries, more specifically in countries such as Japan, Spain, and Italy, household expenditure is the component with the highest value of all. And when analyzing net exports, the variance between the countries is not subject to the category they belong to. In this very sense, we can establish that it does not matter if the country is developed, in economic transition, or developing. They can all have either a trade surplus or a trade deficit. Finally, the Human Development Index as a measure of well-being. Through analyzing the indicators of health, education, and income, we can establish that there are major differences between countries around the world regarding these factors. Firstly, in some nations, the average maximum life expectancy is higher than others. And this inequality can also be seen in education, considering that in some territories, the average years of education are 14 years, whilst in others, it can be as low as 1.5. As the scatter plot in the Excel clearly shows, we can say that there is a strong positive correlation between GDP per capita and the Human Development Index. In simple terms, what this means is that the higher the income per capita, the higher the standard of living in a specific country.
Now we will be analyzing GDP in each country and how it is formed. For this, we chose the 4 main components of GDP, which were previously explained by my colleague. These are household consumption, gross capital formation, government spending, and net exports. What we did first was, taking account in the data, we created a comparison between the US and China. As you can see, here are the real numbers for the year 2018, where you can see that the United States spent around 13 billion in household, while China only 5 billion, but the numbers in government spending and gross capital formation are around the same numbers. And one of the main differences between the US and China comes in net exports, which we will see after. First, here we created a table with the data of the past 49 years and how the GDP and its composition has increased through the years. Here we can see, as I mentioned, the differences in net exports between the United States and China. As we can see clearly in both graphs, the United States imports a lot more than it exports. Therefore, it has a huge trade deficit, while China is the opposite. It has a huge trade surplus. Now, when we compare their populations, as Ricardo mentioned, China's population is around 4 times bigger than that one in the US. That is one of the main factors on why the GDP per capita in the US is way higher than the GDP per capita in China. Finally, we created 3 categories, these being developed countries, economic transition, and developing countries. And we chose 3 countries for each, this being Japan, Spain, and Italy for developed countries, Serbia, Albania, and Armenia for countries in economic transition, and Venezuela, Haiti, and Mali for developing countries. And then we used the HDI as a measure of well-being. This, as you can see in the table, is divided into 3 categories: health, education, and the standard of living. For health, we used the life expectancy as the indicator. For education, we used expected years of schooling and the mean years of schooling. And for the standard of living, we used gross national income per capita, and we calculated the minimum and maximum for each of these values. Finally, as Ricardo mentioned before, in this scatter plot made with GDP per capita and HDI, we can see a strong positive correlation between these 2 factors, which in simple terms, it means that the higher the GDP in a country, the more likely it is that it has a better well-being.
Analyzing our results, we can identify that both the United States and China have experienced economic growth in the last years. Considering the last decades of modernization and industrialization in China, the GDP contributor that stands out is the gross capital formation, which accounts for the fixed assets invested by governments in the country's development. Moreover, government expenditures account for the least contribution to the GDP in China. Low general government expenditures indicate a low investment in the population's well-being, including investments in healthcare, schools, and security. The United States, on the other hand, presents different results. The high contribution of household consumption can be explained through the country's high GDP per capita. This component is associated with all purchases of everyday household needs and cares, and the U.S. purchasing power promotes higher levels of consumption. Further, the capitalist character of the economy suggests a similar behavior between capital formation and government expenditure compared to China's. And additionally, the United States has the greatest trade deficits and GDP in the world, indicating negative net exports are not inevitably destructive, especially on free market economies. Next slide, please. When analyzing the components that play the most significant role in GDP of other countries, we're able to identify that household consumption expenditures represents around 60% of the GDP. The countries that stand out is Japan, with great amounts of household spending and gross capital formation, being a world leader for its industrialization. Moreover, we can notice Venezuela, different from other developing countries, has high household expenses and low government spending, which is no surprise, especially considering the economic and political instability of years. Venezuela's high inflation rates have devalued its currency exchange, turning its export in a competitive price and eventually leading to a trade deficit. Different from the US, however, such trade imbalance generates negative effects in the nation's GDP. Additionally, inflation rates and currency devaluation increase prices on common commodities, including household goods. Even though household consumption spending contribution on GDP is high, it does not mean that the population has high acquisition power, but that most of the money is spent on high-priced basic goods as a result of inflation. Besides the amount of capital involved in each country, the main difference in GDP composition between developing, developed, and transition countries is the amount invested in gross capital formation. Such capital accumulation is especially involved in the country's investments in fixed assets, such as tools, equipment, electricity, and transportation networks that are aimed at increasing the productions of goods and services. Growing economies require higher amounts of capital to continue developing and avoid entering in decline. Next slide, please. The Human Development Index measures the well-being beyond economic health of a country and is a useful tool to compare social development. Yet we consider that HDI fails to provide a complete overview of the country's living standards. For instance, the Gini coefficient, which measures the inequality level of the country, is extremely relevant, and so is the employment opportunity rates. Moreover, security is a crucial aspect of living standards, especially in developing countries, and should be considered in the HDI to provide a more accurate analysis of the country's reality. When comparing both indicators as measures of well-being, we can identify that on one hand, GDP analyzes the life quality based on purchasing power and the government's investment in the city's fixed assets to ignite economic growth. And on the other hand, HDI indicator focuses more on the social aspects of standards of living, like the availability of basic education and healthcare systems. Both consider income as a relevant indicator of well-being since it is directly related to purchasing power, and without it, people are unable to live decently. The positive correlation between HDI and GDP per capita displays that one naturally depends on the other, especially in the free market economies.
Firstly, we will point out the key points from the previous performed analysis that measure well-being indexes in different countries. The comparison between developed in transition and developing countries shows that the developing countries are the ones that tend to have the lowest GDP of all. The major differences between the countries in the different stages of development can be highlighted when analyzing factors such as life expectancy and years of education. These differences are very influenced by the average income per capita of each country chosen for the analysis. As we can see in the scatter plot, there is a positive correlation between GDP and HDI in most of the countries. To measure the GDP of China and the US, we put in a chart the 4 components to evaluate and analyze if there are any pattern behaviors when comparing the 2 countries. And finally, we analyze the Human Development Index as a measure of well-being, yet it fails to provide a complete overview of the country's living standard. Next slide. In conclusion, the Human Development Index and the Gross Domestic Product are solid indicators to understand the basic standards of living in a country.